Let's start with something most people completely misunderstand about the avoidant mind. People assume that love shows up the same way in everyone. More texts, more closeness, more expression. But with an avoidant, love doesn't begin with intensity. It begins with a decision. A quiet, internal decision to stay when every instinct is telling them to create space. Because you have to understand, distance is not slouchy for them. It's regulation. It's how they've learned to feel safe. So when an avoidant starts choosing consistency over distance, that's not casual interest. That's not convenience. That's a fundamental shift in their internal wiring. That's them going against a pattern that has protected them for years, sometimes decades. And here's what it looks like in real life. It's not dramatic. It's subtle. It's the message they send when they could have disappeared. It's the call they return when silence would have been easier. It's them showing up again and again and again, not because it feels effortless, but because something inside them is telling them that you matter more than their comfort. Now, don't confuse this with perfection. They're not suddenly going to become emotionally fluent overnight. There will still be moments where they pull back, where they get overwhelmed, where they need space. But here's the difference. They come back. That return, that willingness to re-engage is everything. Consistency in this context is not about frequency. It's about intention. Anyone can be present when it's easy, but an avoidant who feels authentic love will be present even when it's difficult, even when their mind is telling them this is too much, even when their body is pushing them toward withdrawal. They override that impulse, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to stay connected. And that's where people often miss the signal. They're waiting for grand gestures, for emotional declarations, for some obvious sign that screams, this is love. But with an avoidant, love is much quieter. It's built in the moments where they could have chosen distance, but didn't. Where they could have shut down, but stayed open just a little longer. Philosophically, what you're witnessing is a redefinition of safety. For most avoidants, safety has always meant independence, control, emotional distance. But when they begin to love you authentically, that definition starts to evolve. Safety begins to include you. Your presence is no longer a threat to their autonomy. It becomes a part of their stability. And that shift doesn't happen lightly. It's earned through repeated experiences where connection doesn't lead to loss of self, where closeness doesn't mean being consumed or controlled. So when they start choosing you consistently, what they're really saying without words is, I trust this connection enough to stay. That's powerful because trust for an avoidant is not given easily. It's built slowly, often unconsciously, through observation, through emotional testing, through time. And once it's there, it changes their behavior in ways that are far more meaningful than anything they could say. So if you're looking for proof of authentic love, don't just listen to what they express, watch what they sustain, watch their patterns, watch their presence, watch whether they keep choosing connection when it would be easier to disappear. Because in the world of an avoidant, consistency is not ordinary. It's courageous. And when someone consistently chooses you over their own instinct to withdraw, that's not just interest. That's love proving itself through action. And the truth is simple. When someone chooses to stay where they once would have run, you're no longer an option. You've become something real. Now, once that consistency begins to establish itself, something even more profound starts to unfold. And this is where most people, again, misread the signals, because they're waiting for a big emotional breakthrough, some moment where the avoidant suddenly lays everything on the table. But that's not how it works. With an avoidant, emotional openness doesn't arrive like a flood. It arrives like a crack in the wall. And that crack matters more than any grand declaration ever could. You'll start to notice it in small, almost easy to miss moments. They share a memory that has a little more weight to it than usual. They admit something about their past. Not in detail, not dramatically, but enough for you to realize this isn't surface level anymore. Maybe they reveal a fear or acknowledge a moment where they felt uncertain, or even just say, I don't usually talk about this. Now understand what's really happening here. For an avoidant, emotional walls are not just preferences, they're protection systems. Those walls were built over time, often through experiences where vulnerability didn't feel safe, where openness led to disappointment, rejection, or loss of control. So they learned to contain themselves, to keep things measured, to never give too much access. So when they begin to lower those defenses, Even slightly, it's not random. It's calculated in the sense that it's deeply felt. They are testing safety, not with words, but with exposure. They're asking, without asking, if I show you a little more of who I am, will it still be safe to stay? And this is where emotional intelligence becomes critical. Because if you're only tuned into loud expressions of love, you'll completely overlook what's actually being offered. You'll miss the significance of a quiet confession, a brief moment of honesty, a subtle shift in tone where they let you see something real. These are not small things. These are breakthroughs. But here's the deeper layer. This isn't just about what they say. It's about what they allow. When an avoidant starts letting you see their uncertainty, their imperfection, their inner contradictions, they are doing something that goes against their core identity. They are stepping out of control and into exposure. And exposure, for them, feels like risk. So every time they open up, even just a little, they are taking a psychological risk on you. They are investing trust, piece by piece. Not all at once, not in a way that feels overwhelming, but gradually, intentionally. And if you pay attention, you'll notice a pattern. Those moments start to connect. What begins as a single personal comment becomes occasional sharing. Then it becomes a willingness to stay in deeper conversations a little longer. Then maybe over time, they begin to express thoughts or emotions they once would have completely avoided. That progression, that slow unfolding, is what authentic love looks like inside an avoidant system. Because love, for them, is not about losing themselves in someone else. It's about finding a way to remain themselves while allowing someone else to truly see them. And that is not easy. That requires trust. That requires safety. That requires a belief that vulnerability will not be used against them. Philosophically, what you're witnessing is the dismantling of emotional armor, not through force, not through pressure, but through experience, through repeated moments where being seen does not lead to pain, but to connection. And that's why you can't rush this process. You can't demand it. You can't extract it. The moment it feels forced, the system shuts down again. But when it feels safe, when it feels accepted, those walls don't just drop, they open. So when an avoidant begins to reveal themselves to you in these quiet, subtle ways, don't underestimate it, mate. Don't dismiss it because it's not dramatic. That's not how their love speaks. Their love speaks in access, in permission, in the gradual removal of barriers that once felt permanent. And when someone who has spent their life protecting their inner world starts letting you inside, even just a little, that's not curiosity. That's trust becoming real. And as that trust deepens, you begin to see it tested in one of the most revealing arenas of all, emotional tension. Because it's easy to feel connected when everything is smooth, when there's no friction, no disagreement, no emotional demand. But real connection is not measured in comfort. It's measured in how two people respond when things become uncomfortable. For an avoidant, discomfort has always meant one thing: exit. Not necessarily physically, but emotionally. They shut down, they detach, they create space. It's not manipulation, it's regulation. It's how they've learned to maintain control when emotions start to feel overwhelming or unpredictable. So when tension arises in a relationship, their instinct is not to lean in, it's to lean out. Now here's where something powerful begins to shift. When authentic love is present, they don't disappear as quickly. They don't shut the door as completely. There's a pause, a moment where the old pattern is triggered but not fully executed. And that pause is everything. Because within that space, a new choice is being considered. You might notice that instead of completely withdrawing, they stay in the conversation a little longer. Maybe they don't say much, maybe they struggle to articulate what they're feeling, but they don't immediately escape. Or perhaps they do pull away, but then they come back. They revisit the conversation. They attempt in their own way to repair the disconnection. That effort, however imperfect, is a clear departure from their default wiring. And let's be very clear about this. This is not easy for them. Staying present in emotional tension requires them to sit with feelings they've spent years avoiding. It requires them to tolerate vulnerability, uncertainty, even the possibility of conflict leading to loss. And for someone who equates emotional intensity with danger, that's a significant internal challenge. But love changes the equation. When the connection starts to matter more than the discomfort, behavior begins to shift. Not perfectly, not consistently at first, but noticeably. They start to weigh the cost of leaving against the value of staying. And for perhaps the first time, staying becomes the more meaningful option. This doesn't mean they suddenly become great at handling conflict. They may still struggle. They may still need time. They may still retreat temporarily to process. But here's the key difference. They don't use distance as a permanent solution anymore. It becomes a pause, not an escape. And that distinction is critical because what you're witnessing is not just behavioral change. It's emotional growth. It's the development of capacity, the ability to remain connected even when emotions are activated, the ability to face tension without losing the relationship or themselves. From a psychological perspective, this is where secure functioning begins to emerge. The nervous system, which once associated closeness with threat, starts to recalibrate. It begins to learn that tension does not equal danger, that conflict does not mean abandonment, that emotional expression does not automatically lead to loss of control, and that learning only happens through experience, through moments where they stay, where they engage, where they come back and find that the connection is still there. That's how trust is reinforced, not in perfect harmony, but in repaired disconnection. So if you're trying to understand whether an avoidant feels something real for you, don't just observe how they act when things are easy. Watch how they respond when things get hard. Watch whether they make an effort to remain present, to return, to reconnect. Because anyone can be there when it's comfortable, but when someone who is wired to withdraw begins choosing to stay engaged in the face of discomfort, that's not casual. That's not surface level. That's someone valuing the connection enough to challenge their own instincts. And in the world of an avoidant, that may be one of the clearest signs of all. When they stop running from tension and start growing through it, you're no longer just someone in their life. You've become someone they're willing to fight for. And as this pattern of staying present through discomfort begins to take root, something even more subtle, but deeply transformative starts to happen. Their relationship with independence begins to evolve. Now this is critical because independence is not just a preference for an avoidant. It's an identity. It's how they define safety, control, and self-preservation. For most of their life, independence has meant separation. It has meant, I take care of myself. I don't rely too much. I don't let anyone get so close that they can disrupt my internal balance. And on the surface, that can look like strength. It can look like confidence. But underneath it, there's often a quiet resistance to emotional interdependence, the kind of connection where two people influence each other, rely on each other, and grow together. So when an avoidant begins to feel authentic love, you don't see them abandon independence. You see them redefine it. Instead of their independence excluding you, it starts to include you. Now, what does that actually look like? It's not dramatic. It doesn't show up as a sudden declaration of, I need you. That would feel too exposing, too vulnerable. Instead, it shows up in the way they begin to factor you into their world. They start sharing plans, not as a formality, but as an invitation. They consider your perspective when making decisions. They begin to think in terms of we, even if they don't say it out loud. And that shift from me to we is profound, because for an avoidant, letting someone into their decision-making process is a form of vulnerability. It means your presence is no longer external to their life. It's integrated into it. You're not just someone they connect with when it's convenient. You're someone who now has relevance in how they move through the world. You might notice they begin to open up their routines, the things that were once private or protected, how they spend their time, what they prioritize, what they're working toward. These start to become shared spaces, not completely, not all at once, but gradually. And every time they allow that overlap, they are loosening the rigid boundary that once defined their sense of control. Now here's the deeper psychological layer. Avoidants often equate closeness with the loss of self. Somewhere in their past, connection may have felt overwhelming, intrusive, or even consuming, so they built a system where independence became synonymous with survival. If I stay self-contained, I stay safe. But love challenges that belief. When the connection is right, when it feels safe, respectful, and non-invasive, their nervous system begins to register something new. It begins to recognize that closeness does not have to erase identity. That connection does not have to mean sacrifice of self. And slowly, that rigid boundary softens. They begin to experience something different, interdependence. Not dependence, not losing themselves, but a balanced state where they can still be who they are, while also allowing someone else to matter, to influence, to be part of their internal world. And that's where you see the real shift. They don't feel the need to pull away to reestablish control as often. They don't guard their space with the same intensity, because now your presence doesn't feel like a threat to their autonomy. It feels like an extension of their life. And again, this doesn't come through words first. It comes through behavior, through inclusion, through small, consistent signals that say, you belong here. So if you're paying attention, you'll notice it in the way they start to make room for you, not just emotionally, but practically, in their time, their energy, their future considerations. You're no longer orbiting their life. You're becoming part of its structure. And that is not something an avoidant offers lightly. Because to include someone in their world means they are no longer protecting themselves in the same way. It means they are allowing connection to coexist with independence. And that's a level of emotional evolution that only happens when something real is present. So when you see an avoidant begin to include you instead of keeping you at a distance, understand what you're witnessing. This is not them losing themselves. This is them expanding their definition of self to make space for you. And when someone who once equated love with limitation begins to experience it as expansion, that's when you know it's no longer just connection. It's something they're choosing to build. And as this sense of inclusion deepens, where you're no longer outside their world but part of it, something else begins to shift. And this is where clarity quietly replaces confusion. Because one of the most common experiences people have with avoidance is emotional ambiguity. You're left reading between the lines, questioning intentions, trying to interpret mixed signals. It can feel inconsistent, uncertain, even disorienting at times. But when an avoidant begins to feel authentic love, that ambiguity starts to dissolve, not through dramatic declarations, but through a subtle, undeniable intentionality in how they show up. Now, this is important because they may still not be the most verbally expressive person. They may not suddenly become someone who constantly reassures you with words or labels everything perfectly. But their actions begin to align in a way that reduces doubt. There's less guessing involved. There's a clearer sense of direction in how they engage with you. You start to notice that they prioritize you, not occasionally, not when it's convenient, but consistently enough that it creates a pattern. They make time, not just when they're free, but because they've decided you matter. They follow through on what they say. They become more reliable, more grounded in their presence. And here's the key distinction. It's no longer reactive. It's intentional. Before, their behavior may have been driven by mood, by internal fluctuations, by their need to regulate space and closeness. But now, there's a layer of conscious choice. They're not just responding to how they feel in the moment. They're acting in alignment with what they value. And when they value you, that shows up in consistency, in effort, in quiet commitment. You may also notice a shift in how they communicate, not necessarily in volume, but in clarity. There's less avoidance of important topics, less deflection. They may not initiate every deep conversation, but when those moments arise, they engage more directly. They don't leave everything open-ended or undefined in the same way. That's intentionality, and what's happening beneath the surface is even more significant. Internally, they are beginning to resolve a tension that has always existed within them, the tension between connection and self-protection. For most avoidants, that tension creates inconsistency. Part of them wants closeness, while another part resists it. And that push-pull dynamic is what creates confusion for the other person. But when authentic love takes hold, that internal conflict begins to stabilize. The part of them that values connection starts to carry more weight. It doesn't eliminate their need for space, but it brings coherence to their behavior. They are no longer as divided within themselves. And when someone becomes internally aligned, their external behavior becomes clearer. So instead of wondering where you stand, you start to feel it. Not through promises, but through patterns. Through the way they continue to show up. Through the way they respond. Through the way they make you part of their life without needing to constantly explain it. And this is where many people miss the depth of what's happening because they're still waiting for a certain kind of expression. They're waiting for the words, the labels, the big emotional statements. And those may come eventually. But by the time they do, the truth has already been established through behavior. Because for an avoidant, authentic love is not something they declare first. It's something they demonstrate over time. It's in the quiet reliability, the reduction of mixed signals, the shift from uncertainty to grounded presence. It's in the fact that you no longer feel like you're trying to decode them. You're experiencing them. And that experience brings something powerful into the relationship. Emotional stability. Not perfection, not intensity, but stability. A sense that this connection has weight, direction, and intention behind it. So when you begin to feel that shift, when confusion gives way to clarity, when inconsistency becomes intention, recognize it for what it is. This is not them changing their personality. This is them aligning their behavior with what they truly feel. And when someone who once lived in ambiguity starts showing up with quiet certainty, you don't need constant reassurance, because their presence has already become the answer. And as that clarity settles in, where their actions begin to align, where their presence feels intentional rather than uncertain, you arrive at what is perhaps the deepest and most transformative shift of all. This is the point where the avoidant doesn't just engage with you differently, they begin to confront themselves differently, because up until this stage, much of their behavior has been automatic. The distancing, the emotional shutdown, the need for space, these patterns have operated almost like reflexes. They weren't always questioned, they were simply justified. This is just how I am. I need space. I don't like too much emotional intensity. And for a long time, those explanations were enough to maintain their sense of control. But authentic love disrupts that comfort. When an avoidant truly starts to care about someone, something internal begins to shift. They become aware, sometimes for the first time, of the impact of their patterns, not just on the relationship, but on themselves. They begin to see that the very mechanisms that once protected them are also limiting their ability to experience the depth of connection they now find themselves wanting. And that awareness can be uncomfortable, because it creates a kind of internal conflict. On one side, there's the familiar instinct to withdraw, to protect, to maintain distance. On the other side, there's a growing desire to stay connected, to deepen, to not lose what they're starting to value. And when those two forces collide, they can no longer operate unconsciously. They have to choose. This is where self-awareness becomes transformation. You may start to hear it in the way they speak. They acknowledge their tendencies. They might say, I know I pull away sometimes, or I'm not great at this, but I'm trying. Now, to most people, those might sound like simple statements, but in the psychology of an avoidant, that's a breakthrough, because it means they're no longer fully identified with the pattern, they're observing it. And once someone can observe a pattern, they can begin to change it. But here's what's even more important. It's not just what they say, it's what they do with that awareness. Do they begin to make small adjustments? Do they pause before withdrawing? Do they attempt to communicate instead of shutting down completely? Do they come back with more intention when they've created distance? That effort, that willingness to work through their own resistance, is one of the clearest indicators of authentic love. Because now, the relationship is no longer just something they participate in when it feels comfortable. It becomes something they are willing to grow for. And growth, in this context, is not easy. It requires them to challenge long-held beliefs about vulnerability, about dependence, about emotional safety. It requires them to step into unfamiliar territory, where control is not absolute, where outcomes are not guaranteed. But they do it anyway. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but with intention. And that's what separates surface-level connection from something real. Anyone can enjoy connection when it doesn't demand change. But when someone begins to evolve because of what they feel, when they start facing parts of themselves they once avoided, that's when love moves from feeling into action. From a philosophical perspective, this is the moment where love becomes a catalyst for self-expansion. It's no longer just about how they feel toward you, it's about who they are becoming in the presence of that feeling. And that's powerful, because now, the relationship is not just giving them comfort, it's inviting them into growth, into a version of themselves that is more open, more aware, more capable of connection than they've ever been before. So when you see an avoidant begin to question their own patterns, to take responsibility for them, and to actively work through them, not because they're being forced, but because they want to, that's not casual, that's not temporary. That's someone who is emotionally invested at a level that goes beyond comfort. And in the end, that's the clearest truth of all. When someone is willing to face themselves so they don't lose you, what they feel isn't just attachment, it's love, powerful enough to transform them. And when you step back and look at all of this together, a very different picture of love begins to emerge, especially when it comes to the avoidant mind. Because what you've just seen isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, and it doesn't follow the traditional script most people expect. It's quieter than that, slower, but in many ways, far more meaningful. Love in this context is not about intensity, it's about transformation. It's in the consistency where there used to be distance. It's in the vulnerability where there used to be walls. It's in the presence during tension where there used to be escape. It's in the inclusion where there used to be separation. It's in the clarity where there used to be confusion. And ultimately, it's in the self-awareness where there used to be unconscious patterns. That's the journey. And if you really understand this, you stop looking for love in the obvious places. You stop chasing words, labels, and grand gestures as your primary proof. Instead, you start observing behavior, patterns, effort, growth, because that's where real love reveals itself, especially in someone who was never wired to express it easily. Now, here's the truth most people don't want to hear. Loving an avoidant requires a different kind of awareness. It requires patience, emotional intelligence, and the ability to recognize subtle shifts that others might overlook. But it also